The small velvet box slid across the granite with a sound like a sigh. It came to a stop next to a neat stack of $100 bills, fanned out just enough to look like a hand of cards. A losing hand. My wedding ring, and what he'd deemed my half of our savings. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of the dark roast coffee I had just brewed for him, the kind he liked, with notes of chicory and burnt sugar. The refrigerator hummed, a low, constant drone that suddenly felt like the only thing holding the silence at bay. His words were still hanging in the space between us, more solid than the morning light slanting through the blinds. A phase. He had said it so casually, as if describing a season or a passing interest in a new genre of music. He had looked at our 7 years, our home, the entire architecture of the life I thought we were building, and declared it a temporary structure, a pop-up shop that had run its course. My name is Yvette. I am 30 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I was a wife. I'm a certified public accountant, a woman who builds her life and her career on the principles of order, balance, and the unyielding logic of numbers. For me, the world is a series of ledgers. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. Every entry must be accounted for, every column must reconcile. I believed a marriage was the ultimate balance sheet. A long-term investment, a shared portfolio of trust and effort that would appreciate over time, yielding dividends of comfort and partnership. Lionel, my husband, was 35. We had been married for 7 years, together for 9. Long enough, I thought, to have moved an investment out of the volatile, high-risk category and into the stable, blue-chip portion of our lives. I was wrong. Lionel, it turned out, didn't see our marriage as a long-term asset. He saw it as speculative stock, something to be held during a bull market and liquidated the moment it seemed more profitable to cash out. The inciting wound wasn't a shout. It never is with men like Lionel. The deepest cuts are delivered quietly, with the unbothered calm of someone ordering a coffee. It was a Tuesday. He was dressed for his job as a senior logistics manager at a major automotive supplier, a job I had essentially procured for him. He wore the navy suit we'd picked out together, the one that made his shoulders look broader, and the silver tie clip I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. He stood on the other side of our kitchen island, the polished granite a cold, neutral territory between us. He had already withdrawn the cash from our joint savings account that morning. $10,000. He counted out $5,000 for me, placing it on the counter as if it were a tip for services rendered. Then came the ring box. He didn't open it. He just pushed it toward me. "I think you should have this back," he'd said, his voice even. I stared at the box, then at the cash, then at his face. I was looking for a crack in his composure, a flicker of grief or regret. There was nothing. He just looked finished, like an auditor who has closed a file. "Lionel, what is this?" My own voice was a stranger, thin and brittle. He took a sip of his coffee, the coffee I made. He leaned against the counter, a posture of casual finality. And then he delivered the line that would detonate the foundation of my world. "It was a phase, Yvette," he said, his gaze not quite meeting mine. It drifted toward the window, toward the life outside that was apparently calling to him. "People outgrow each other. It's natural. I outgrew you." Outgrew. The word was so precise in its cruelty. It wasn't that we had failed. It wasn't that he had changed his mind. It was a matter of scale, of evolution. He had expanded, and I had remained the same. I was a starter home, a first car, a set of training wheels he no longer needed. A phase. Our vows, our shared holidays, the nights I'd held him when his father was sick, The mornings he'd brought me tea when I was studying for my CPA exams. All of it relegated to a developmental stage, like adolescence or a college major he'd abandoned. The casualness was the venom. He wasn't ending a sacred contract, he was simply closing a chapter, and the book, it seemed, was mostly about him. The insult wasn't just in the leaving, it was in the reclassification of everything that had come before. He wasn't just erasing our future, he was demoting our past. The archaeology of disrespect begins long before the tomb is uncovered. It's a slow erosion, the steady accumulation of dust over something that was once precious. For years, I had been the silent architect of Lionel's professional life. When I met him, he was working a dead-end job in inventory management, full of ambition, but utterly lacking the tools to realize it. He was smart, charming, but his potential was a raw material he didn't know how to refine. I, the accountant, the strategist, saw the numbers. I saw the path from his current state to his desired one, and I charted it for him. It started with his resume. The first version he showed me was a mess. A single page of duties without accomplishments, written in Times New Roman. It was a document that screamed mediocrity. We spent an entire weekend at our dining room table, which became my unofficial office for Project Lionel. I didn't just edit it, I interviewed him. I pulled accomplishments out of him he didn't even recognize as valuable. I taught him the language of corporate achievement, transforming managed warehouse stock into implemented a new inventory tracking system that reduced product loss by 15% over 2 quarters. I quantified his worth. I chose a modern, clean font, structured the layout for maximum impact, and wrote a compelling professional summary that positioned him not as what he was, but as what he could be. I did this not once, but 3 times over the years, each resume a more polished and impressive artifact of a career I was curating for him. Then came the interview coaching. Lionel was terrible in interviews. He got nervous, he rambled, his charm curdled into a visible sweat of anxiety. So, I became his coach. For weeks before a big interview, our living room would transform into a mock corporate boardroom. I played the part of the hiring manager, the HR representative, the stern department head. I drilled him on the STAR method: situation, task, action, result, until he could answer behavioral questions in his sleep. I recorded him on my phone so he could see how he fidgeted, how his eyes darted around the room. We worked on his handshake, his posture, his vocal tone. On the morning of the interview for the job he currently held, I laid out his suit, made sure his tie was perfectly knotted, and walked him through breathing exercises in the car. I was his strategist, his cheerleader, his publicist. The job itself came through my network. One of the senior partners at my accounting firm had a brother-in-law who was a VP at a major automotive parts supplier. I heard about a potential opening in their logistics department, and I made the connection. It wasn't a simple email. It was months of careful social cultivation. I made sure to be at the firm's charity golf tournament, steering the partner toward a conversation about his family. I mentioned Lionel's recent and newly exaggerated accomplishments. I positioned him perfectly. I didn't ask for a favor. I presented an opportunity for the partner to place a promising candidate. It was a delicate, strategic dance, and I choreographed every step. Lionel got the interview, and because of our endless coaching, he got the job. In the beginning, he was grateful. The first year, every success was our success. "We got the promotion," he'd say, popping a bottle of champagne. "I couldn't have done this without you, Yvette." He'd hold my hand at company parties, introducing me with a pride that felt genuine. I was his partner, his secret weapon, but gratitude, I've learned, has a shelf life. The erosion began subtly. It started with his sister, Camille. Camille was a force of nature, sharp, ambitious, and possessing a deep-seated belief that her brother was a king temporarily living among commoners. She saw me not as his wife, but as his handler, and a temporary one at that. Her visits were always punctuated with backhanded compliments and helpful advice aimed squarely at Lionel. "That's a nice little apartment," she'd say, looking around our tastefully decorated home that I had painstakingly furnished on a budget. "But a man on the rise like Lionel needs a place that reflects his status." She spoke about his career as if it were a solo flight to the moon, and I was just ground control. "Marriage is sweet, but it can be a distraction," she told him once over dinner, right in front of me. "You need to be hungry, focused. It's slowing you down." Lionel, who once would have defended me, our life, would just offer a weak smile. "Camille's just intense," he'd say later, but her words were seeds, and they found fertile ground in his growing ego. Slowly, he began to echo her. The pronoun shifted from we to I. "I got the bonus," he'd announce. "My career is really taking off." My contributions were slowly erased from the narrative. The coaching sessions became "a few pointers you gave me." The networking became "a lucky break I capitalized on." My meticulous, exhausting labor was downgraded to a footnote in the story of his heroic ascent. Contaminated memories are the cruelest ghosts. I remember the night he got his first major promotion, the one that put him on the senior management track. We went to a fancy steakhouse downtown to celebrate. I felt a deep, resonant joy that night, a feeling of shared victory. I saw our future stretching out before us, secure and bright, a future built on our mutual effort. He stood up to make a toast, champagne flute in hand. I smiled, expecting him to thank me, to acknowledge the partnership. "I want to thank my sister, Camille," he said, his voice ringing with emotion. "She always knew what I was capable of, even when I didn't. She never stopped pushing me to be better." He raised his glass to me then, almost as an afterthought. "And to Yvette, of course, for all her support." Support. I wasn't the architect anymore. I was a support beam, a piece of infrastructure, necessary but invisible. The joy of that evening curdled in my memory. I sat there smiling, a perfect portrait of the supportive wife, while something inside me registered the change. The books were no longer balanced. A debt of recognition had been created, and I had a sickening feeling it would never be repaid. The complicity is the hardest part to account for. I let it happen. I was so invested in the project of his success, which I had conflated with our success, that I didn't notice he had privatized the profits. I kept balancing the books, cooking the numbers in my own heart to make the story work. I told myself his ego was fragile, that he needed to feel like he'd done it himself. I absorbed the small slights, the erased history, because the alternative, admitting that the man I loved was taking credit for my work, for my strategy, for my mind, was too painful to contemplate. I was a CPA who was refusing to audit her own life. I was willfully ignoring the glaring discrepancies on the balance sheet of my own marriage because I was terrified of what the final accounting would reveal. The disrespect wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping insolvency I had allowed to fester for years. The breaking point when it came wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet, devastating audit. It happened on a Thursday night, about 3 weeks before he called our marriage a phase. Lionel had fallen asleep on the couch watching a basketball game. His tablet lay on the coffee table, screen still glowing. It was a shared device, but he used it most. A message notification popped up. a group chat with his two best friends from college, a chat I didn't even know he had. My name was in the preview. Curiosity is a dangerous, insistent thing. I told myself I was just going to move it to the charger, but my fingers acted of their own accord. I picked it up. The chat was open. I scrolled up. My breath caught in my throat. It was a long thread, weeks of conversation. They were planning a boys' trip to Miami. It was full of the usual crass jokes and bravado, but then I saw the paragraphs about me. Yvette is getting so clingy lately, Lionel had written, always asking where I'm going, what I'm doing. It's like I can't breathe. Clingy. Was that what my questions were? Asking if he'd be home for dinner, trying to plan a weekend together? Was that a cage? I had been feeling a distance between us, a growing chill, and I had been trying to bridge it. He had interpreted my attempts to connect as attempts to control. His friend Marcus replied, "You gotta do you, man. Life's too short." And then came the line that stopped my heart. Lionel's reply, "I know. We're basically separated already, just living in the same house. It's been like this for months. I'm just waiting for the right time to make it official." Basically separated already. The words flickered on the screen. I read them again. And again. Time seemed to warp. The sound of the television, the squeak of sneakers, the roar of the crowd faded into a dull hum. The air in the room grew thin and cold. In that moment, something inside me went perfectly, terrifyingly still. As an accountant, I'm familiar with the moment of discovery in an audit. It's the moment you find the hidden ledger, the secret set of books that tells the real story. It's the moment you realize the numbers you've been working with, the reality you've been presented, is a complete fabrication. There is no rage in that moment. There is no grief. There is only a profound, ice-cold clarity. The chaos of confusion and doubt solidifies into the hard, clean certainty of fraud. He had been performing a role. Our marriage, for him, had already ended months ago. He was just running out the clock, keeping up appearances while he made his own plans. The distance I felt wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a policy he had implemented. My attempts to fix us were, from his perspective, an annoying nuisance. I wasn't his wife. I was a roommate whose lease was about to expire. I looked over at him sleeping on the couch. His face, so familiar, was suddenly the face of a stranger. A stranger I had given my time, my intellect, and my loyalty to. A stranger who had taken all those assets and recorded them in an account I wasn't allowed to see. The visceral sensation was not of a heartbreaking. It felt like a switch being flipped deep in my mind. The part of me that made excuses, that hoped, that loved him, simply went offline. A new system booted up. It was efficient, logical, and entirely devoid of emotion. I documented every joint asset, the condo, the car, the investment account, the furniture. I downloaded 3 years of bank and credit card statements, highlighting every major transaction. I was preparing the evidence, building a case. Not for a fight, but for a clean, indisputable separation. My grief was private, but my accounting would be impeccable. Day 2 was for logistics. I spent the day in a fugue state of focused action. I found a new apartment online, a small but sunny one-bedroom in a quieter neighborhood. I took a virtual tour, filled out the application, and was approved by mid-afternoon. I signed the lease digitally and paid the deposit and first month's rent from my new private account. Then I booked the movers. I scheduled them for the following Tuesday, a day I knew Lionel had back-to-back meetings and wouldn't be home until late. The woman on the phone was pleasant and efficient. "Will you need packing services, ma'am?" she asked. "No, thank you," I said calmly. "I'll be handling that myself." Day 3 was for sorting. It was a Saturday. Lionel went to play basketball with his friends, the same friends he'd been complaining to about me. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I began. I moved with a strange, emotionless efficiency. I went through our shared life room by room, making piles. My things, his things, our things. The decisions were swift, almost brutal. I took only what was unequivocally mine, and the few shared items that held meaning only for me. The beautiful set of ceramic bowls we bought in Mexico? I left them. The memory was contaminated. The worn armchair he loved? His. The art on the walls, the rugs, the television. I mentally signed it all over to him. I was stripping my life down to its essential assets. I was traveling light. Day 4, Sunday, was for packing. I had ordered boxes, tape, and markers online, and they arrived in discreet brown packaging. Lionel was engrossed in a football game, shouting at the television. The noise was a perfect cover for the quiet sounds of my departure. The rustle of packing paper, the squeak of the tape gun, the soft thud of a full box being set on the floor. I started with my home office, the place where I had built his career. My books, my files, my degree framed on the wall. It all went into boxes labeled with my neat, precise handwriting. Then my clothes, my shoes, my personal effects from the bathroom. He never once came into the spare room where I was staging my new life. The irony was almost too much to bear. The man who complained I was too clingy had no idea I was systematically erasing myself from his home. He was so accustomed to my presence being the background hum of his life that he didn't notice when the music was about to stop. Day 5 was Tuesday, the day of the wound, when he stood in the kitchen and delivered his speech about outgrowing me. I felt no shock, no surprise, only a quiet, final confirmation of the data I had already collected. His words were not the cause of my leaving. They were merely the final entry in a ledger I had already closed. He thought he was firing me from the job of being his wife. He had no idea I had already tendered my resignation 5 days prior. He was a man giving a speech in an empty auditorium, mistaking the echo for applause. He left for work that Tuesday thinking he had ended things. He believed I would spend the day crying, calling my mother, falling apart in the ruins of the life he had just demolished. He imagined he was in control, that he was the one driving the narrative. He underestimated me. He always had. He saw a wife, a support system. He never saw the CPA. The movers arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, just as I had scheduled. I was an accountant looking at a clean slate, a zero balance. My final act was a quiet piece of symbolism. On the wall of our bedroom hung a large, framed piece of calligraphy I had commissioned for our first anniversary. It was our wedding vows, written in elegant, flowing script. It had been the centerpiece of the room, a daily reminder of the promises we had made. I lifted it carefully from its hook. The wall behind it was a slightly paler shade of paint, a perfect rectangle marking the space where our foundation was supposed to be. I carried it over to the dresser, to his side, which was still cluttered with his watch, his wallet, the loose change from his pockets. I didn't smash it. I didn't throw it away. I simply laid it face down, the beautiful words hidden against the dark wood. An annulment in a single gesture. I left my keys with the doorman, a kind man named Hector who had seen us come and go for years. "Moving out, Ms. Yvette?" he asked, his eyes soft with a question he was too polite to voice. "Just moving on, Hector," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I walked out into the Detroit morning. The air was cool and crisp. My temperature was measured, unhurried. I was already gone. I had left days ago. This was just the paperwork. As I got into my car and pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. There was nothing to see. You can't see a balanced sheet. You can only feel the rightness of it. The first text started at 6:15 p.m., right when he would have gotten home. The first was a single question mark, then a rapid succession. "Where are you? Where is all your stuff? This isn't funny, Yvette. Call me now." I watched the messages appear on my phone's locked screen, each one a small burst of frantic light. I was sitting on the floor of my new empty apartment, eating takeout from a carton. I did not reply. My silence was its own response, a void where my immediate, reassuring presence used to be. I imagined him walking through the hollowed-out rooms, the echo of his own footsteps accusing him. He was discovering the true cost of what he'd given away, and it was far more than the $5,000 he had so casually handed me. An hour later, the phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was a master class in deflection. "Yvette, I get home and half the apartment is gone. What is this? Some kind of dramatic, manipulative game? After everything I've done for us, you pull this immature stunt? You could have at least talked to me like an adult." He, the man who had called 7 years of marriage a phase over morning coffee, was lecturing me on adult communication. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost elegant. I deleted the message without a second thought. The next day, his sister Camille called. I knew it was a strategic deployment. He had failed to get a response, so he sent in his reinforcements. I decided to answer. "Yvette," she began, her voice dripping with condescending concern. "Lionel is worried sick. He told me what happened, and I have to say, this is really not the way to handle things. Running away solves nothing. You need to come home and talk to him." "Hello, Camille," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Thank you for your concern, but this is a private matter between Lionel and me." "It stopped being a private matter when you abandoned your husband and your home," she snapped, her mask of concern slipping. This was the moment for a mic drop line, a quiet correction. "I didn't abandon my home, Camille. I just took it with me." I hung up before she could respond. The escalation cascade continued for days. Pleading texts, angry voicemails, emails promising he could change. He was cycling through every tool in his kit, trying to find the one that would work, that would bring his comfortable life back. He didn't understand that I wasn't a broken appliance to be fixed. I was a business that had been closed down, its assets liquidated. His final attempt came a week later. He found my new address, I assume through a mutual friend he'd pressured. He showed up at my door on a rainy evening, looking wrecked. His hair was a mess, his eyes were bloodshot, and he wasn't wearing the polished armor of his expensive suits. He looked like the man I'd first met, the one who was full of insecurity and unrealized dreams. For a moment, a flicker of pity stirred in me. He started to cry. It wasn't the dignified grief I had felt in private. It was a messy, panicked sorrow. The tears of a man who has lost a convenience he never realized was essential. "I messed up, Feta," he sobbed. "I was an idiot. I was listening to Camille, to my friends. I don't know what I thought. Please, just come home. We can fix this." I stood in the doorway, not moving. I felt a deep, weary sadness, but my resolve was like steel. "There is no home to come back to, Lionel," I said quietly. He looked at me, his face collapsing in on itself, and then he said the most honest, most revealing thing he had ever said to me, the line that showed he had learned nothing at all. "You'll come back," he whispered, a desperate certainty in his voice. "You have to. You don't know how to be alone." He thought my life, my identity, was built around him. He saw my loyalty and my labor not as a choice, but as a defining feature of my character. He couldn't conceive of a version of me that existed independently of him. He thought my entire being was a liability on his balance sheet. I looked at him, the man I had once loved, the man whose career I had built from scratch, and I felt the last vestiges of my old life fall away. It was time for a redefinition. "You're wrong, Lionel," I said, and my voice was gentle, but absolute. "I was never alone. I was just lonely with you." I closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the final, satisfying entry in a long-closed ledger. In the months that followed, I didn't just rebuild, I restructured. For years, I had worked as a CPA at a large firm in downtown Detroit, balancing the complex books of corporations and wealthy individuals. My days were spent in a world of other people's assets, other people's ambitions. My own professional life was steady, secure, but it was in service to others. It was the same pattern as my marriage. I had been using my greatest skills to build someone else's empire. The separation agreement was swift. My meticulous documentation meant there was little to argue about. Lionel, humbled and represented by a lawyer who clearly knew he had a weak case, agreed to a fair division of assets. My half was enough. It was the seed money I needed. I didn't go back to the firm. Instead, I took the biggest risk of my life. I leased a small, second-floor office space in a historic building in Corktown. It had exposed brick and a large window that looked out over the street. I used my savings to buy a good computer, professional software, and comfortable chairs for future clients. I hung a simple, elegant sign in the window: Yvette Thompson, CPA, Individual and Small Business Accounting. The first few months were terrifying and exhilarating. I was the CEO and the janitor. I designed my own business cards, built a simple website, and networked relentlessly, this time for myself. I reached out to small business owners in the neighborhood, the new coffee shop, the independent bookstore, the floral designer. I offered them something the big firms couldn't: personal attention, a genuine investment in their success. My first client was the owner of a bakery down the street, a woman named Maria who made the most incredible pastries, but whose finances were a shoebox full of crumpled receipts. We sat in my new office, the air smelling of fresh paint and possibility, and for 3 hours, I helped her make sense of her numbers. I created a budget, set up a payroll system, and found deductions she never knew existed. When we were done, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I feel like I can finally breathe," she said. That was my vindication. It wasn't about getting rich or showing Lionel what he'd lost. It was this: the quiet, profound satisfaction of using my skills to bring order to chaos, to empower someone else to build their dream. My work was no longer invisible labor propping up an ungrateful man. It was visible, valued, and transformative. My mornings became a sacred ritual. I would arrive at my office before anyone else, when the sun was just beginning to warm the brick outside my window. I'd make a cup of coffee and sit at my desk. And for the first hour of the day, I would balance my own books, my business accounts, my personal budget, my retirement savings, the neat columns, the clean lines, the perfect reconciliation of debits and credits. It was a form of meditation. I was the sole proprietor of my own life. Every asset was mine. Every decision was mine. The peace I felt in those quiet mornings was more valuable than any promotion Lionel could ever have earned. My resolution wasn't a grand, dramatic victory. It was the slow, steady, and deeply satisfying process of building a life that was finally, completely my own. About a year after I left, I saw him. It was inevitable in a city that can feel, at times, like a small town. I was at a cafe in Midtown, meeting a new client who owned a graphic design studio. I was early, so I was sitting by the window, reviewing my notes. When I looked up, I saw him standing in line. My first reaction was nothing. There was no jolt of anger, no pang of sadness. It was like seeing a character from a television show you used to watch. Familiar, but distant. Part of a story that was no longer yours. He looked different. Smaller, somehow. The custom-tailored suits had been replaced by a rumpled polo shirt and jeans. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a kind of weary slump. He looked ordinary. Just a man waiting for his coffee. The myth of the corporate titan I had helped create had dissolved, leaving behind this unremarkable reality. He turned from the counter with his cup, and his eyes met mine. I saw a flicker of panic in his face, then recognition, then a deep, complicated shame. He hesitated, taking a half step in my direction as if he might approach. I didn't smile, but I didn't scowl. I simply held his gaze, my expression neutral. It was enough to stop him. He gave a short, awkward nod, then turned and quickly walked out of the cafe. I watched him go. There was no triumph in my heart, no satisfaction in his diminishment. There was only a profound sense of distance. He was a closed file, a completed tax year, a part of my history that had been audited, reconciled, and archived. My client arrived a moment later, a bright, energetic woman full of ideas. I turned away from the window, smiled, and began a new conversation about a new future. There is a language to accounting that, I've come to realize, is also the language of love and loss. We speak of investments, of assets and liabilities, of profit and loss. For a long time, I believed a marriage was an appreciating asset, something you poured capital into, the capital of time, of effort, of forgiveness, and watched it grow with the magic of compound interest. I thought endurance was the same as investment. I was wrong. Some relationships are not appreciating assets. They are sunk costs. They are ventures that will never be profitable, no matter how much you invest. You can spend years trying to balance the books, cooking the numbers in your own heart to make the story make sense. You can carry someone else's debt, categorize their neglect as a temporary market downturn, and tell yourself that things will rebound. But at some point, a good accountant has to face the truth of the numbers. A good accountant knows when to write off a bad investment, to accept the loss, and to free up her capital for a venture that will actually value it. Leaving wasn't a declaration of his failure. It was an acknowledgement of my own worth. It was the bravest, most honest piece of accounting I have ever done. I audited my life, and I found a catastrophic discrepancy. The person I was carrying on my books as an asset was, in fact, my greatest liability. So I did what any good CPA would do. I reconciled the accounts. I closed the ledger. My books are finally balanced. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.